Hey everybody, this is Carlos Velez from Lacerta Bio in New York. We just finished an interesting project and thought I would record this short video to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we learned on this project. This was a scouting project, an in-licensing project on behalf of a client. So obviously I can't get into a lot of the detail regarding who this client is and so forth, but suffice to say that this is a geographically focused company who has been very successful in three therapeutic areas. And they're looking to in-license clinical stage assets in those therapeutic areas. They're also beginning to look into rare diseases, again, within those therapeutic areas. But they have been struggling to find clinical stage licensing opportunities within those areas. And so we got involved to try to help them find some interesting drug candidates for them to in-license. And as part of all this, we came across several problems, which unfortunately were not unique to this particular client. And the first problem we observed is what I call the demand supply problem. That's a silly name, but it is what it is, right? What is this demand supply problem? Look at it this way. In these particular therapeutic areas where my client was involved, the unmet clinical needs are actually minimal. They're very well served by existing therapies. These are highly genericized markets, lots of effective drugs out there, very cheap. And there frankly isn't much of a demand for innovation in those therapeutic areas. Now, obviously, there are always going to be some exceptions in some very specific indications, but in general, these particular therapeutic areas were fairly well satisfied from a commercial drug point of view. So because of that, there's no demand for innovation, which means that there's a lack of demand, there's a lack of early stage investment in startups to develop new drugs in these therapeutic areas. So because of that, there are really no sort of big pharma companies looking to accept, early stage licensing risk because those opportunities simply don't exist. If there's no demand, there's no investment, there's no demand from let's say the big pharma side. So at the end of the day, companies like my client will struggle because there's simply no supply of interesting clinical stage opportunities to in-license. So that was problem number one, this demand supply problem. I mentioned earlier that my client is delving into the rare disease space. Okay. What is rare? What does that mean? Now, I don't have data on prevalence of specific rare diseases by geography or by country, but we do know, or at least we can speculate, that a disease that's rare in, let's say, the US may be more common in another geography or may actually be non-existent in another geography. So that's one issue with rare disease. And the other issue with rare disease is that different countries, different areas define rare differently. Okay, this is one graphic. You can see the link there. So what's rare in one area may be non-existent in another. Cystic fibrosis is one example of this, which is I believe is still classified as a rare disease in the U.S., but in other countries, cystic fibrosis is just non-existent. It doesn't even exist. Or if it does exist, it's so small that you can't build a business case around it because the number of patients is so small. So delving into the rare disease space, while obviously commendable, may be challenging from a licensing point of view if a company is developing something for a rare disease in one part of the world for a disease that just doesn't exist or is even rarer in your part of the world. So it makes it more difficult to build a business case around rare disease candidates that are being developed for diseases in other geographies. So the definition of rare has a geographic component that's actually quite important from a business case building point of view, which sort of leads to the third problem, which is home sweet home. Um, Look, there's a lot of companies in our industry that are geographically focused. We see them in Europe, we see them in the Middle East, we see them in Asia. There are several, Canadian geographically focused companies. We see them in South America, et cetera, et cetera. That's nothing wrong with that. From a licensing point of view, it does have some implications. One is that it essentially forces these companies to consider relatively mid to late stage candidates because, if I'm a biotech and if I have something early stage, I'm probably not going to license this to a company if that company's focus is only on Canada or Japan or Israel or Germany, right? If I'm a small company, I'm going to be looking for that big pharma global deal, or at least a very large regional deal, to get the resources needed to get that candidate moving. So if I'm sitting in one country, essentially the supply that's going to come to me is going to be relatively late stage. Okay, nothing wrong with that, but that gets to the second and third point here, which is, first of all, like I mentioned earlier, the economics of signing a deal from a licensor and licensee perspective probably doesn't make sense for something that's relatively early. Okay, the economics are just not going to be there. I would much rather sign a deal with a big pharma as opposed to a smaller regional company, which really means, like I said earlier, it creates a problem, a supply problem. A lot of the quote unquote good candidates may be already gone. They may be already licensed to a big pharma player who has the resources to develop something globally. Or maybe those really good assets are already licensed to a US partner, European partner, and a Pan-Asian partner. And so if you're a regional player, you're just not going to have access to some of these candidates, especially the most innovative ones. All right. Now notice something about all these problems. These problems really have nothing to do, in theory, they have nothing to do with the skill of the BD team. Okay. This is not a BD competence issue, although we do see that issue in some companies. But that may not be the case. Oftentimes the problem here is not with BD. The problem here is corporate strategy. There's a strategic problem here. There's a big strategic problem here. Now, why this happens, it's hard to say. Maybe it's just comfort with, staying in these markets, sort of being traditional. Maybe it's corporate hubris. We were very successful with this product. Now let's just go find another one that's just as good as the first product we were successful with. So BD teams and these companies can run really good processes. They can be very active. They can go to the conferences. They can access the databases. They can review the literature, et cetera, et cetera. But if there's no supply, for the reasons that we talked about, it's going to be very, very difficult for some of these regionally focused companies to execute on really good licensing opportunities. So what should these companies be doing? Difficult conversations have to take place. And there are four of these that I've identified here. Obviously, these are all interact with each other. These are not four things that should be discussed in the vacuum. The first one, frankly, the obvious one is, begin to move into other therapeutic areas, whether they're adjacencies to existing therapeutic areas or just jumping into completely different therapeutic areas, perhaps at the expense of existing ones. Maybe now is the time to monetize and reinvest. Big pharma companies do that. They out-license or outright divest products, groups of products, et cetera, and take those proceeds and reinvest. It's not easy to do. There will be some pain involved, but that certainly is one approach. Related to that is the geographic question. Obviously, if you're a company focused in geography A, now may be the time to start looking at expanding into geographies B, C, and D. It does suggest perhaps some M&A, especially some acquisitions of other regional players and other geographies, executing sort of a buy and build strategy. But that's never simple. It's expensive. It's risky in the sense that now the acquirer is accepting all sorts of risk beyond just product and commercial risk. that this is a strategy that may be easier, and I use the term easier very loosely, for listed companies that have liquid shares as opposed to a private company, because the capital has to come from somewhere. And so obviously, merging these two ideas of looking into alternate geographies and alternate therapeutic areas, it's something that can be done. It's easy to say. It's easy to say to do this. It's obviously very difficult to execute. Third is accepting risk. Okay, if nobody is accepting early stage risk, if the VCs and big pharma are not accepting that early stage risk, maybe it's time for some of these geographically focused companies to start to accept early stage risk. Now, structurally, how that happens is arguable, and it's a debatable point. Maybe it's partnerships with venture funds. Maybe it's an internal sort of VC fund type structure. Maybe some combination of those two. Maybe it's the time to sign a global deal and then sublicense once those candidates are mature. Again, that's accepting a lot of risk on just one candidate, but again, it may be what's necessary if focus on those particular therapeutic areas is pretty much something that a company like this wants to do. And then lastly, I think I made this point already, is nothing wrong with jumping onto the rare disease bandwagon only if it makes sense for your particular geography, the particular geography that we're talking about. So that's basically it. Again, these are kind of some quick lessons that we've learned while working on a recent scouting project. If you have any questions about anything that we've talked about, just ping me via email or via social media. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.